This book about the myths of sports coaching, written by Amy and Jenny, I read a few years ago, and it covers 20 different myths in sports coaching which I think are applicable across disciplines. The first myth is about deliberate practice. Not necessarily 10,000 hours, as original research wasn't saying 10,000 hours is the best number or the magical number. That was made up by Malcolm Gladwell inside of his book The Outliers, and what the chapter goes on to discuss, that it's not necessarily the quantity of hours but the quality, where effort and enjoyment are really important in the type of practice you're doing. Deliberate, purposeful, naive practice with different aims or intentions for the practice from the coach's perspective, the learner's perspective, and those watching, i.e. parents or carers and things like that. The original research looking to challenge the nature versus nurture debate, not giving a quantity, a number for practice. And so what useful or effective practice is actually far more complex than just 10,000 hours. Which brings us to the second myth about fun. Fun not necessarily being just messing around and doing games that have nothing to do with skill development or skill improvement. Actually, fun involves skill development. That is one of the biggest tenets, the most important tenets of fun. Working hard to get better. It is a myth that fun is for recreation or fun is for more boys or more girls or younger or older. They all look for the same 11 tenets of fun, the most important being looking to improve, working hard to improve. So fun in sport performance and fun in recreation actually look for the same things. But that's very different to the third myth, which is about communities of practice. Coaches, learners, developers, teachers feel that if you're having a conversation with someone, it's a community of practice. We're all learning together and it feels fairly simple, but that's not accurate as to what a community of practice is when we look at the practical application. I used to think a community of practice was a WhatsApp group of us talking about the same things, or a Twitter group, but unless there is an intention to improve, to challenge, to critique different ideas, it's not a community of practice. Similar with the idea that communities of practice are echo chambers and everyone repeating the same things and agreeing. That's not necessarily an effective community of practice. In the same way that you don't need a leader, a person in charge, to have a community of practice, because everyone needs to contribute in a similar way to challenge and improve different ideas. So if anything, you want different opinions in a community of practice to push one another moving forwards. Which for me relates to coach education. When I finished my degree, I thought, I'm going to join lots of groups and I'm going to develop there. But unless there is intention, there is action towards critique, ideas, bit of reflection and review on different practices, all you're doing is saying the same thing, which becomes more of an echo chamber rather than a community of practice. But obviously, that means a community of practice is harder than I first thought. And in a similar way, fundamental movements is more complex than I originally thought when I went into my degree. Fundamental movements being the basic movements that everyone needs to understand. Fundamental movement skills or functional movement skills are terms that I was brought aware of in university, and throughout my degree I realised actually there's a few myths behind that, and that's what they discuss in the book. Linear stages of learning going from one to the next isn't quite accurate. Learning is non-linear. It's all over the place. We go forwards and backwards, we make mistakes, we challenge, and sometimes we can even skip stages, which I've seen now coaching inside of my practice trampoline. Some people can do skills that are arguably too hard because they haven't done the fundamentals. But if it was a fundamental, but they can do something harder, was it really required? Not necessarily, and that is the myth of how we develop skill over time. We're looking for dynamic movement solutions to different problems rather than doing skill 1, then skill 2, then skill 3, etc. It's non-linear. As a coach in trampoline, it is a traditionally female-dominated sport. You look at competitions, the female categories are filled, whereas the male categories are far less. I was competing against 2 or 3 others, my sister competing against 60 or 70 others. But the higher up you go inside of competition, it seems to level out. But the way that you coach females and the way that you coach males is actually very, very similar. Coaching female sport, coaching my sister's team, was very similar to coaching male sport. And that is a bit of a myth, again discussed in the book. Males and females are looking at the same way of development, Of course, there are different physical capabilities and considerations to be aware of, but when we're working with individuals, they are very similar across the board. We need to be unique and inclusive of all individuals, being aware of what people are able to do and their skill development, non-linear skill development process. A quick example from my personal experience, one of the coaches told me that girls are more likely to be talkative in their sessions, but when I was actually coaching the girls, they actually were focused on the session more than the boys. So the myth that girls want to socialize more than the boys, I experienced firsthand. The girls were actually focused on the session and the boys were more worried about talking about the game at the weekend, which seemed to contradict what I was told. Hence, me exploring the myths of sports coaching broadened my view on this. But sometimes, no matter how many times people discuss a myth, discuss how something isn't entirely true, or you need to understand the meaning behind things, people can still believe it, and it's still in coach education, which is the next myth: learning styles, VARC learning styles, visual, auditory, reading, and kinesthetic learning styles. Do we have methods or mediums at which individuals learn in certain contexts? Yes, but can you match a learning style to an individual? No, not really, and that's what loads of research have said, but it's still in coach education. One of the courses I'm currently doing is suggesting I need to teach using all of the learning styles. But as an example, I can't use an auditory learning style for someone that is profoundly deaf. It's not possible. I think that's fairly obvious, so we would use the mediums that are available to us for both individuals and anyone else involved to communicate clearly. Which brings us to an interesting topic in sport, which I think also relates to school education: the role of parents or carers, stakeholders, other people involved in that learning experience, the developmental experience of doing things, learning things, because parents in sport can be seen as a bit of a problem or an issue or a barrier, and I feel that might be the same in school, from teachers' experiences with parents at parents' evening. I don't know, I'm not a teacher, this is me guessing and looking at other conversations I've seen online. But as discussed in the book and from my own experience, I don't think parents are the problem. And from my own coaching experience at the moment with the trampoline club that I run, parents are actually really helpful. They're really useful because they want the best for their child. And so helping them help their child means that there are now two people, potentially more, helping one individual develop. So they don't necessarily get in the way, they're just trying to do their best, from my experience at least, alongside a lot of the discussions inside of the book. And a quick example of this is that parents are the problem. One of the individuals I work with struggles to communicate with other people apart from their parents because that's who they feel comfortable with. So I work with the parent who works with the individual, rather than me working directly with the individual. And now, as I've created the relationship with the individual, we can now speak back and forth. But it started with the parent being the help, the inroad, the communicator to start with. Them not being the problem, but actually the solution. Which, for those that do coach sport, either on a volunteer basis or whether they're paid to coach sport, coaching can feel like a full-time job. And it is a full-time job. Teaching is a full-time job, probably a bit more with the amount of workload that they're asked to do in certain countries, certain places. And I'm speaking specifically for England because that's where I coach, that's where I understand the coaching environment the most. Volunteer coaches, it is a full-time job, even though they are volunteering a lot of the time, because they're thinking about the practice, they're thinking about the admin, they're thinking about the sessions, who to play, when to play, how they develop, how to navigate certain conversations, who do they pair people up with, do they pair people up with, how do they manage the sessions, whether it's one session a week, 2 sessions a week, the game at the weekend, or the competition they need to travel to. There's lots of thinking that goes on outside of that 1 hour session slot. And for me, I feel this relates to coaching, sports coaching specifically, being more of a profession than something you can do a weekend course on and become a coach. There is a lot that's involved, but it's not necessarily discussed as much as I personally would like it to. But what makes coaching a profession is another whole conversation. And one of those topics in that bigger conversation is early specialization or early diversification, because those coaches that may have done a weekend course might think deliberate practice. Remember that myth at the start, deliberate practice, you need to focus to get as good as you possibly can. Well, if you do that right at the start, you may specialize in an individual right at the start, which could lead to burnout. It could lead to a peak and then boredom. It could lead to overuse injury, or it might not actually be as effective for skill development because they are so specialized with their movements, finding the ideal movement solution rather than exploring their physical capabilities, which would suggest early diversification might be more effective. If you look at the background history of a lot of professional athletes, they did other activities early on. And if we look at the UK as an example, we seem to be very good at youth performance, but when it comes to adult performance, we tend to drop off a bit from success. And that could be due to an overemphasis on performance in academies and at youth levels, early specializing, and then overuse injuries, burnout, drop off, various other reasons for the lower level successes, I guess you could say, at the adult level. But if I was to pick one example for this video, take Luke Littler. They played football up until about 9-10 years old, then they specialized in darts, not straight away. And so Luke got to explore movement, then specialized and then invested in that specification of darts. Now, typically as you move towards performance sport and you're looking at the Olympics or you're looking at world championships, you might get some sports science teams. So you've got strength and conditioning coaches, maybe some physios and nutritionalists. And of course, most of this sports science is related to health and fitness, and there are various myths going on throughout nutrition, throughout strength and conditioning, physiotherapy, etc. And a few myths that I mentioned in the book about nutrition is water. There isn't a set amount of water you need to drink a day because it depends what you do in the day. It depends how big you are, how small you are, what you do with the water, with your body. Everyone is slightly different. And when we're playing sports, water isn't actually necessarily the best way to rehydrate because the body uses other things from H2O, which is why we have sports drinks. Not Prime, that's the other situation, but sports drinks are there for a reason. So water isn't necessarily the best way to rehydrate. And you may have seen lots of things being shared online about different levels of protein per grams per body mass, but at the end of the day, it comes down to what you're training, what you're doing with your body, and whether you actually need the protein to fix, heal, mend, build the muscles. Once again, one of those it depends, there's not a one-size-fits-all number. Which brings me on to reflection, because when I'm thinking about all of these different myths, I would say, oh, I'm reflecting on this, but reflection and evaluation, as I found out in my first year, are different things. I remember I used to say I reflected all the time. I'm always reflecting on how I'm coaching, how I'm doing things, but it was more evaluation because I was saying, that's good and that's bad. I rarely went into why and critically analyzing, critically thinking about why was that good, why was that bad, and not necessarily saying, oh, that was good because of this thing. Could I have done something else that might have been better, that might have been more effective? Or did I do that and there was another option, but I chose to do it for a reason? There was a reason why I picked this less effective method to this more effective method for that specific context. And if there was, do I have a rationale? Can I justify that by research? Or am I doing it because it felt right or that's how I was coached? What is the rationale behind my behaviors? And that is the difference between, for me, reflection and evaluation. And so reflecting on this next myth about pro athletes becoming pro coaches, I feel there is a huge bias from your experience as a pro athlete to becoming a pro coach. Coaching and playing are two different things, and the skill set are drastically different. Do you have experience playing in a professional environment? Yes. Do you have experience coaching individuals? Not necessarily. And so those individuals that go from pro playing to pro coaching aren't necessarily as effective as a coach that hasn't played at that level. And that is the myth, which I actually want to extend a little bit further and say some of the best and most effective coaches we have aren't at the performance level, aren't at the top of the sports. They could be midway or towards the bottom, towards the quote recreational levels, because they are working with individuals and pushing them forwards. They are getting leaps and bounds in skill development and potentially getting lifelong engagement in physical activity, which may not lead to high-level sport performance, but they're helping individuals be consistent throughout their life, being physically active and arguably healthier, but also hitting some of the biggest milestones in skill development, again emphasizing that fun element of practice design. Which, when I think back to my level 1 course, practice design was there, you'd get given some sessions and some drills to do, but there was a lot of emphasis on questioning, the assumption that questions lead to learning. But That's not entirely true, because if the question is ineffective, there might not be much learning. If it is a very closed question looking for one answer, the one ideal solution, which is a bit of a myth in itself, the question again doesn't lead to learning. It leads to an answer, but not necessarily skill development. There are coaches and teachers campaigning for question, keep questioning, query-based learning instead of instruction, but sometimes instruction, direct instruction, is useful. Direct instruction to add constraints to a practice can help the individual learn themselves, but the instruction does that rather than the question. So it's not that questions are better than instruction or instructions are better than question. It depends on the context, and questions don't always lead to learning. Questions could lead to a lot of confusion and making the task too complex, which actually hinders learning, not helps. Which of course is psychology, whether it's sports psychology or educational psychology or psychology in the broad sense of the study of anything to do with thinking, the mind, cognition, because psychology is cognitive science, I would argue. And the idea that psychology fixes, the sports psychology fixes the problem is a myth. And as discussed in the book, psychology is more proactive. It's more about preventing the issue from occurring in the first place, rather than going to the psychologist after there was an issue, which is why I believe, and why my degree was heavily focused on psychology, coaching as a psychology discipline, a psychology-focused discipline, to help individuals develop through their time and not need to be fixed because they're broken, but to keep them engaged throughout their lifespan, again emphasizing that fun engagement inside of practice design. Bringing me to goals. If we're adding goals, are they effective? Are they ineffective? SMART goals. Specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, time-bound. Should we be doing SMART goals? Should we be giving everyone SMART goals? Because that's effective, that's the useful way, that's the useful thing to teach people something? Well, just like in most of learning science, it depends on the context, because sometimes asking someone to just try their best, do their best, try hard, that number one tenet of fun, try hard, is enough for a goal. It is a direction. It gives them intention for the practice, for them to focus on what it is they need to do. So give them an intention and they can pay attention to where they need to go. Doesn't necessarily need to be bracketed in this SMART, SMARTER, whatever acronym you want to put on there for the goals. And the way the individual looks at the practice, the intention, the direction, the goal, the destination of that behavior relates to how they feel about that situation, which could lead to clutch performances. Is there such thing as a clutch performance or a clutch performer, someone that can clutch the best thing in a high-risk situation? According to the conversation in the book and the research that I've looked at, there's not really a clutch performer. It's someone's ability to perform under high pressure, high perceived pressure, or high perceived risk, depending on how they see that situation. And if they're familiar and have worked in those situations before, they might not perceive it as risky as other people may do, which is where confidence, perceived control, and challenge appraisal get involved in this situation. Are they going to be helped by their coaches, by the supporters? Again, using Luke Littler as an example, Dad in the crowd is encouraging him to do as good as he could, which is why he got the World Championships, or I would argue one of the reasons why he got the World Championships. Luke's dad being a perfect example of a caring coach, not necessarily being cruel and direct and giving them punishments for not doing things or punishing them for making mistakes, being a psychologically safe coach, a caring coach, giving them the opportunity to make the mistakes and learn from those mistakes. Coaching, teaching, being a two-way relationship, the athlete being able to trust the coach being able to trust the athlete or the teacher or whoever it is that's educating the individual. It doesn't have to be a punishment, cruel world, but there is an element of stakes that's got to be involved in any sort of practice design for individuals to problem solve, because there's got to be a problem there to start with. I know, learning from my experience, you can be really, really caring, but some people need a bit of stakes. They need a bit of risk to push themselves to do something, to challenge themselves just a little bit. Give them an idea, give them a challenge. I use challenge cards in my practice, which ties into the individual. Is the individual resilient? Is something I've heard coaches talk about, and another myth discussed in the book. Individual resilience as a trait, something they're born with. They're born with resilience. They're born with the determination, the motivation to get better, to improve. Or is it actually developed over time through the culture and the environment that they're practicing in? resilience not being a trait that you're born with, that you just have, but something that can be developed over time through various training, various practice, various behavior that a coach, that a teacher can help encourage someone towards. But all of this depends on the coach-athlete relationship, which isn't just the coach and the athlete. There is more than that, because there's the rest of the group, the rest of the team, the parents, everyone else that's involved. So society, there is a social element to the coach-athlete relationship, especially if there are things being shared online or discussions that go outside of that conversation. Everything nowadays is connected. We're all sharing different things, like me here. There's the relationship I have with the athletes that I work with, the people that I work with, and that is going to be involved with this video, because if they see it, they can then share their thoughts elsewhere. And so the coach-athlete relationship is something that is ongoing, is developing socially, not just between the two conversations that you have, whether it's verbal conversations, sign conversations, or just looks across the room. But this book covers all of those myths in more detail, which I'm going to be going through on this channel in a video series. And so if you're interested to hear more, or have some thoughts, or share some thoughts, or give me some ideas about how you would apply, or how you've experienced some of these situations inside of coaching in sport, or coaching in some other business context, or maybe teaching inside of a school, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, and obviously subscribe to make sure you get notifications about the upcoming videos.